Lecture 18, Confucius.
In this lecture, we'll be dealing with the philosophy of Confucius. And I'll begin by setting to rest what might strike some people as something of a mystery. Why is it, if Confucius is such a prominent Chinese thinker, that he doesn't have a Chinese name? Well, obviously he did have a Chinese name. Confucius is a kind of Latinization of Kung Fu Zi, the Honorable Master Kung. We'll continue to use the usual reference Confucius, but this isn't a name that he would have recognized. He lived in the period overlapping the 5th and 6th centuries BCE, and he seems to have had more impact, I suppose, than anyone else in East Asia. What's striking is, if you read anything about his biography, he felt as though he had really failed to be very influential. This is certainly a case where posthumously his influence has traveled a lot further than he would have ever imagined. He's known as China's first private teacher. Basically, in the course of his life, he had attempted to become influential by means of getting a government post. And he actually succeeded in getting a fairly high position by the time he was 50. But political intrigue, office politics you might say, ended up leading to his having to retire and basically leave the state where he was employed. So for the next 13 years, he was basically an itinerant teacher. He had a group of students that gathered around him. And he certainly hoped that he could get an influential government position in some other state, but this dream was very frustrated. He also viewed himself as not so much an originator as a transmitter. I think this indicates something that's actually more widespread in Chinese philosophy than simply in Confucius' way of expressing himself or in the Confucian tradition, namely that innovation, originality, isn't necessarily viewed as a good thing. Certainly Confucius is extremely innovative, but what he focuses on is the fact that this is carrying forth what's important from the tradition, that basically he's not trying to improve on what the sage kings, the sort of legendary founders of Chinese society, had come up with, but instead he's transmitting it, carrying it forward, bringing it into a new generation. What was distinctive is Confucius' way of interpreting certain ideas that had been extant before then. The main one that I'm going to focus on is the idea of nobility. Nobility in China, as in other parts of the world, was typically viewed as something that was a function of what family you were born into. Confucius' idea was that nobility ought to be a moral concept, not a kind of socio-political one. A person's merit, not the family that they were born in, is really what's decisive in whether or not one is a noble person. The term used, junsa, is translated variously. One translation that I think gets some of the flavor of this across is the expression gentleman. We use the expression gentleman sometimes just as a kind of general way of referring to men in general, as in ladies and gentlemen. But we also use the term gentleman to refer to someone who is particularly exemplary. So-and-so is a true gentleman. There's also the feudal aspect of gentleman too, though, the idea that someone belongs to the aristocracy. And that's one of the reasons I think it's a somewhat flawed translation, but it's important to keep in mind that for Confucius, when he talks about the exemplary person, he's really using the same word that would have been used to refer to people in aristocratic positions. His suggestion was that if people learn to cultivate themselves, if people commit themselves to the way, another use of the word Tao, the way of becoming an exemplary person, then they indeed can become one. In fact, it's possible even for anyone in principle to become a sage. Now, what does he mean by cultivation? Education, first of all, is absolutely crucial. Confucius tended to focus on education in the classics. And so when he is talking to his disciples, he'll often emphasize something that occurred in the classic of poetry, for example. The classics, in his view, are a kind of bedrock that enables people, once they've mastered them to some extent or learned in them, to do a number of things. With education, first of all, one can be much more self-reliant than otherwise. But also, it allows people to have a kind of reverence for their tradition. If you look back through the classics, he views the possibility of good role models from the past becoming important. The time that Confucius is living in was a very, very disturbed time. There was a lot of social turmoil. So reverence for those great, dignified people of the past who have played a role that is really exemplary struck Confucius as a really valuable thing in learning to cultivate oneself. It gives you a certain distance from your own time and an appreciation of those in one's tradition that have really been exemplary. This also enables one to learn from history. If we have these kind of notions of what happened in the past as, in a way, models to draw from, then we might have a better sense of where we are in the present. Now, as I mentioned, in Confucius' time, the social order was not very good. In many cases, wandering warlords were trying to amass empires for themselves. And they had, in various ways, usurped the control of various small societies or small governments away from the legitimate king. Sometimes this was more or less by means of gaining influence over the king. So the king wasn't necessarily deposed, but nevertheless you had warlords who were effectively running things. And most of them weren't content with what they had, but wanted to continue to expand their domains. So Confucius is addressing at this time a real concern about where society is going. Actually, this might be a common denominator of many philosophical thinkers in lots of traditions. Socrates, too, came at a time when there were some real problems happening in Greek society. Certain things were not working as had been intended, and that's one of the things he's pointing out, that basically we need to be rational, that we've started to become irrational in certain ways. Confucius' view was we become uncivilized to a certain extent, and this is what we don't want to continue. So the civilizing message of his teaching, it really is a way of addressing this concrete reality that there is war all over the place. And as is not surprising, people had come to not trust their governments, or each other for that matter. As Confucius sees it, the role of a government is to provide for people's needs and to create social harmony. And certainly when warlords took over, that was not really high on their priority list. Most of them simply wanted power, land, control, etc. So basically, the way things were going, governments weren't able to take care of their proper business. As Confucius sees it, the government should be, and he's assuming here that we have a sort of sovereign, emperor, king, whatever. In this case, his understanding was that we need a hierarchical structure. Somebody is going to be the ruler, but the ruler's role is something like a parent who's concerned with the whole of society. And when a ruler stops being concerned with the whole of society, that ruler, in some sense, is falling away from the real role of being a ruler. We'll talk a little bit more about this, actually, in the next lecture. But in this kind of situation where you've got people taking over the role of ruler officially, in that they have the power, but not taking over the real responsibility of rulership, people were starting to distrust each other, and in general, you had a pretty uncivil society. Interestingly, because Confucius does try to renovate this notion of what a true gentleman is, what a true ruler is, it's rather interesting that at the same time he urges going back to tradition. Because you might say, well, look, he's trying to challenge the way things are. At the same time, he was very much interested in returning to ritual as a kind of basic way of organizing society. The word for ritual, li, includes a lot of things that probably we don't think of in terms of rituals. Granted, in Confucius' time, there were a number of very specified rituals. Sometimes one gets a kind of account in the Analects, a book that was put together by disciples of Confucius after his death. You get descriptions of certain rituals that Confucius was very, very observant about. And you get the impression that there were all kinds of details of everyday life that Confucius thought were great that we would find very stilted. But I think it's helpful to keep in mind what our own rituals are. As Confucius saw it, Li, ritual, was a means of restoring community.